So welcome everyone. My name is Michael Schatz. I'm one of the co-hosts of this session today for the NIH Cloud Platform Interoperability, the spring workshop here. Next slide, please. So just to kick things off, I'm joined by Anthony Philippakis. Next slide. And we're the co-directors for the Anvil, and we're just really excited to be here today to organize this event. Anthony, do you want to say a few words?
Yeah, thanks very much. I have to say the NCPI effort, I think, is a really important one. And it's been a real pleasure to work with Mike and others in order to plan out the day today, and really looking forward to spending this time with all of you.
Great, thank you. Next slide, please. So as I'm sure most or all of you are aware of the call of the NCPI. So right, this is an interoperability effort for all of NIH to be able to connect together different cloud platforms. So we have participation from the Anvil, from the Biodata Catalyst, from the NCI Common Research Data Commons, Kids First, and also now from the National Library of Medicine through some of the NCPI platforms. So this is really, really exciting to be able to kind of bring together all these platforms to make sure that that users have single sign-on, that data can be shared, that the tooling can be shared, that we have interoperability about how the sort of data are represented and can be exchanged. So on the right there, there's sort of a pie chart kind of breaking down some of the data sets that are available in a very interoperable way. We're really approaching, in my mind, what is a really exciting milestone. Currently we have about 828,000 participants. So most of this is whole genome data. So we're approaching 1 million genomes that can be shared across these different platforms. It's just enormously impactful, enormously powerful to be able to aggregate all those data, look for those associations, look for kind of genetic contributions in ways that have just never been looked for any way before. The key to this has been sort of the technologies that we've all adopted, the standards that have been put into place, and just sort of the technologies that allow us to kind of share all this information so seamlessly and share kind of a user experience across all these different platforms. So I think that the sort of spirit of today and tomorrow are to kind of celebrate all the accomplishments that have been had, talk about the amazing science that has been made possible, and then I'll also talk about the future. What can happen next to take these technologies and even make them even more impactful. Next slide. So today we're going to get started. Right now we're just in kind of this welcome session to bring everyone in. For the next couple hours, we're going to have kind of a series of presentations talking about some new initiatives from the NIH, talking about their strategic vision for data science, successes and opportunities for the next 5 years. Then we're also going to have kind of a follow-up discussion from ODSS, the Office of Data Science Strategy, to talk about data and compute infrastructure. That'll be followed up by a presentation on something called the data mesh. We kind of learn about that technology and interoperability there. And then other platforms that are kind of participating or kind of adjacent to the NCPI effort that we want to kind of hear from their success stories for interoperability. After kind of a lunch break, then I'm really excited to have a discussion with some leading experts from cloud vendors to hear about what those platforms offer, also get their impressions about where the landscape is moving into the future, hear about some interoperability technologies that may be relevant to us here as well. Then in the afternoon, we're going to have a series of breakout sessions. So there'll be there'll be 5 breakout sessions, 5 separate rooms. People are just basically randomly assigned to different rooms. And then each of those different rooms will be tasked to talk about 4 different topics. So data mesh, reproducibility, resources and service readiness for AI and machine learning, and then how do we expand the interoperability efforts with additional partnerships. So each of the 5 different rooms will cover each of those 4 sessions. Then we'll have a report back, hear about the different discussions for each of them. Next slide. So that's today's agenda. And then tomorrow, I won't go into as much detail, but then there'll be sort of discussions and presentations from within NCPI to hear progress that's made across the working groups, hear about some of the science that's been driven. We'll hear about some additional interoperability technologies. And then tomorrow afternoon, we'll also have some additional breakout sessions to kind of brainstorm across the group here to hear about other sort of dimensions we can bring to the table. Next slide, Anthony.
Just to close out, some of you might have heard me say this slide before, but I'm really a big believer in the importance of what we're all trying to do here today. And I kind of want to say that it won't happen on its own and will really take a dedicated work by this group. You know, a few years ago, there was a book that I read that I highly recommend. Some of you might, especially if you're a history of science and technology person. And it was about the origins of the internet and the history of how it all happened. And I think it's important to realize that there are several parts of our world that have been managed to organize themselves and create federated data ecosystems. You know, the banking industry actually did an incredible job with Swift. You know, the internet and the web are the examples we all think about. And it's also important to realize that it doesn't always happen. You know, the healthcare system did not actually get its act together, and the ability to send medical records between healthcare systems is in an abysmal state and really lags behind so much of the rest of the modern world. And so, you know, I really kind of want to close out this section with a call to action for all of us to realize the importance of the NCPI effort, and that this really is the most kind of visible and important effort to try and drive interoperability across NIH. So with that, we can go on to the next slide, and looking forward to the first session today.
Okay, thank you very much, Anthony. So we're going to go into the first session. It'll be a series of presentations about the NIH strategic vision for data science classes and opportunities for the next 5 years. This will be by Lauren Biven from ODSS. Lauren? All right, Laura.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be opening this workshop for the NCPI. I couldn't agree more with the comments of the previous speaker that this is an incredibly important activity for NIH and for data interoperability. I'm speaking on behalf of my boss, Dr. Susan Gregorek, who's the Associate Director for Data Science, and unfortunately couldn't be here this morning, but she has graciously lent me her slides. And what I'd like to do is give you a sort of context for the NCPI program. And so I'm going to walk you through the NIH strategic plan for data science, and also talk to you about how we're thinking of updating that strategic plan and the conversations we've had within NIH and with our communities that are informing that process. So next slide, please. So we have a vision for data science at NIH, and it's to create a modern and integrated, fair biomedical data ecosystem. And we do that in a number of different ways, supporting common infrastructure and architectures, leveraging commercial products, thinking about workforce development and policy. And so we have a number of these different components that make up the implementation of our strategic plan. Next slide, please. One back, I think. Thank you. Great. So the strategic plan for data science has a number of different goals or components. And the first one is around data infrastructure, and then another one around modernizing the data ecosystem, thinking about the data management, analytics, and tools that we need, workforce development, and then stewardship or sustainability, which is really a sort of policy component. And I'll go through each of these in turn and just highlight a number of the NIH programs which are addressing each of these strategic goals. And I'll try and do this kind of quickly because I want to spend more time on where we're going and how we think our strategic plan, you know, sort of how our strategic plan is forming for the future. So next slide, please. Oh, sorry, before I dive into those, I want to make sure that I emphasize that this is really an NIH-wide activity. So across the different activities that we have implementing the data science strategic plan, we have over 190 NIH staff from 23 institute centers and offices contributing to these efforts. It's really a wonderful coalition of the willing and able participants and subject matter experts across NIH. Next slide, please. The first goal is around infrastructure. And so some of the key programs that we have at NIH that are supporting this goal of our strategic plan include the STRIDES initiative, which you might know is NIH's approach to leveraging commercial cloud computing for our researchers. The RAS authentication service, which is a single sign-on service that will help us enable, well, as you know, I think very well, help us enable cross-platform workflows. And then of course the NCPI project. So all of you, you are a really important part about how we're thinking about data infrastructure and data interoperability at NIH. Next slide, please. When we think about the data ecosystem, we think about efforts that help us make data fair, both from the as generated in our research teams, as well as how they're stored and curated through our knowledge bases and repositories, and then also partnering with generalist repositories that live outside of NIH as well, and helping to make those an integral part and seamless part of our ecosystem. Next slide, please. We think also about software and tools, and we have a number of programs in this space. One is a joint venture with the National Science Foundation, our Smart and Connected Health program. We also have efforts to encourage researchers to develop sustainable and reusable software, and then also working directly with communities and fostering communities of practice in software. Next slide, please. In workforce and training, we have a number of different efforts. One of them is our data scholars at NIH. So this brings experts in data science into the NIH to work for 1 or 2 years. We have a Coding It Forward summer fellowship program for students, and then a number of other different training and learning opportunities for graduate students and even high school students across the country. Next slide, please. And then, although not directly led by the ODSS office, a number, there's a lot of movement at NIH in the policy space, as I'm sure you know, around our data management and sharing policy, which will come into effect in just a few short months. We have data stewardship programs led by the National Library of Medicine, and efforts that we have around data curation networks. And then joint ventures that we have with professional societies, including FACEB, to try to highlight some of the some of the cultural change that we want to see around policy and stewardship. Next slide, please. So we recognize that there are still a lot of challenges, and the strategic plan that we currently are working from was developed, I think, in 2019, roughly. And so this is a very fast moving space. And so we're thinking about, what do the next few years look like for us, and what are the challenges that we really need to focus on? So next slide, please. Many of these in our conversations internally at NIH, as well as with our external stakeholder communities, have identified these key areas. These are not exclusive of other ideas, but I just wanted to give you a flavor of what we're seeing. So certainly challenges around federated data infrastructure. We are federated by nature with our institutes and centers and our sort of organizational structure. Our data ecosystem will be federated by nature. So how do we really make that work for our researchers? How do we have efficient access to controlled access data? Controlled access data is also just an inevitable part of our research space. How can we really make that work for researchers? Integrating clinical, real world, administrative, and digital health data. That's one of the wonderful aspects of NIH, is that we're able to bring sort of both the clinical and research aspects together in close proximity. So how can we have that reflected in our data ecosystem? And then some of these data services, sort of key data services around search, building cohorts, and developing knowledge. Next slide, please. So let me walk you through a number of different sort of themes that have come out to us that sort of form a framework for how we're thinking about the strategic plan going forward for NIH and data science, and what we're thinking are our key challenges and opportunities. And as I walk through these, maybe keep these in the back of your mind as you're having your discussions over the next couple of days, and think about how NCPI really fits in this larger picture, how you can really inform us about key challenges and opportunities relating to each of these topics. And I think maybe this will hopefully be somewhat food for thought in the coming days. So next slide, please. So the first one is around harmonizing data infrastructure and services. So we want to improve the fairness of data, computing, and modeling resources across the NIH. And so this really gets to the heart of this federated data challenge. And one of the ideas that's come up is sort of thinking about data mesh, and what does that mean? How can we really combine our research, our data with a combination of services and infrastructure? And I should say the bullets under the ideas section in all of these slides are meant to be suggestive of things that we might prioritize. It's not written in stone, and it's certainly not exclusive at this point. Next slide. Enhancing researchers for AI and machine learning. So AI and machine learning didn't actually factor in to our top level goals for the current strategic plan, but that's clearly been a priority over the last few years. And so thinking about that particular technology and how NIH can really use AI and machine learning to unlock the discovery potential of our data, as well as using our data to engage with AI and machine learning experts to influence the trajectory of those technologies and making sure that they're working for our mission. So that involves increasing efforts around data and metadata standards, thinking about ethical AI, the potential for using synthetic data sets to either complement small data sets or think about de-identification or getting around issues of identification. And then model development, iterative training, incorporating in social determinants of health. There are a lot of sort of rich research challenges in this space. Next slide, please. So the third area is in promoting interoperability of data and data resources. So we want to promote the fairness, not just across our data resources, but also across other data research objects, such as code, to create a fully interoperable data research ecosystem. So this is thinking about not only what we need for interoperability of data, but also thinking about what we need for composability of our services, interoperability of code, as well as potentially AI models. Next slide, please. Fostering broad research use of healthcare data. So this is a space where more research is needed to think about how we can incorporate healthcare data into the research context and what sorts of metadata standards or best practices we might need to develop. And it's related to our next bullet. So if you go to the next slide. This is really about adopting existing health IT standards for research. So making sure that we're leveraging what's coming out of the community as well as the private sector to best advantage and leveraging those things in the research context. So how can we take some of the things that are coming out of industry, for example, and really leverage them for a research context? Next slide, please. We also want to think about software, not just in terms of the products, but also in terms of the workforce development and a culture of software development. So we really want to be able to blend the best practices coming out of industry and the innovation and creative approaches coming out of research into a really robust culture of software development for research. So we're thinking about metrics and best practices and how we can really encourage reusability of software and sustainability of those software products. Next slide, please. We do also want to make sure that we are maintaining, what is unique to the research space, which is really leveraging the innovative and creative ideas coming out of research. So we want to make sure that we're, leveraging that sort of creativity from our research base, as well as keeping pace with some of the innovation that's happening at industry. So making sure that we're keeping pace with some of the cutting edge software technologies as they develop. Next slide, please. Workforce development is always going to be a part of our mission. It's really important to thinking about the sustainability of our efforts. And so we want to strengthen not just the expertise in data science, but also broaden the base of and diversity of people who are able to engage in data science. And so there are a number of different ways in which we're thinking about workforce development from a multidisciplinary and also a diversity perspective. Next slide, please. In terms of how we will go about updating our strategic plan, we're going to be refining some of these key ideas and concrete steps. We'll develop evaluation metrics. We do plan on updating the strategic plan and then inviting the community for feedback in a formal way, like an RFI or something like that. And then we'll sort of put it through our management paces through NIH leadership, and then finalizing the document sometime next year. So we're eager to hear from you about how NCPI can really address some of these challenges, contribute. If you have ideas for opportunities and challenges that you haven't yet seen in these slides, we'd love to hear from you about that as well. I think there might be a final slide. If you can click to the next one. And finally, I just want to say that we recognize that these are not just technical challenges, they're cultural challenges. I know that's something that NCPI, I think, is really leading the way in terms of how we address both sides of that coin, not just the technical side, but also the social and sort of organizational side. So I really want to applaud you for all the work that you've done so far. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the discussions over the next 2 days. So thank you very much from me, and also on behalf of Susan. I really appreciate your time, and I'm sorry if I've run over a bit.
Oh, thanks very much. I think you're actually just right on time. I think, in fact, we have a couple minutes. We can open it up for questions. Maybe probably the
Sure.
simplest thing to do would be, put them in the chat, or maybe raise your hand if you have any sort of quick questions. To that last point about cultural change, to me, I see this as like one of the major barriers. People are used to doing the work in a particular way, and it can be hard to kind of move people on to kind of new platforms, new ideas, new way of doing things. I'm wondering, what are your kind of major thoughts about how we can help encourage that that transition? What sort of activities can we be doing really focus on the cultural change?
Yeah, we've certainly had a number of different, sort of workshops and conversations with the community to try and identify what some of those barriers are. And you have done that as well. I know, some of the things that have come up, of course, are just education and understanding of those tools and how to use them, but also understanding cost barriers. And I also think, that's sort of addressing barriers, but I also think that there's a lot of value in showing the potential of new technologies. And I think that's one of the things that NCPI does wonderfully. And we always love sort of highlighting the success stories about cross-platform workflows that you're able to enable through this program, because I think showing the value of some of these new technologies and the efforts that we're investing in goes a long way to incentivizing people to put in the extra effort to use those different technologies.
I agree. It's just a very exciting landscape to be able to have that interoperability.
Laura, I'm wondering if I can ask you a question. I remember when I first entered into biology in 2001, so it tells you how old I am. At the time, there was a big push to get people from physics and computer science and math. And there were special training awards that were kind of dedicated to, if you have a PhD in physics and want to do a postdoc in biology, this is a great award to apply for. Going back to your point about a culture of software, has NIH ever thought about doing a similar type of program about getting people from the software engineering industry to try and migrate over to life sciences, and creating special awards that are, targeting software engineers, not necessarily PhD level scientists?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I'm not sure we've had that specific idea, but we certainly are thinking about ways to acknowledge and credit the work that software engineers do in our space. And so thinking about not just partnership opportunities, but really, uniquely highlighting their role in making software reusable and sustainable. But I think that's a great idea.
We have a question. Oh, go ahead, Anthony.
Yeah, I was just saying the same thing, Mike, about the question from the
Yep.
chat. So okay, yeah, so maybe I'll ask, Becky Boyles asked a very important question. Increasing the diversity of people who can participate in this work in data-driven science generally continues to be a challenge. Can you please comment on ODSS thoughts on how to address that?
Yeah, I think, so first of all, highlighting that as an untapped potential, right? So I think that it's a priority for ODSS to make sure that people can participate in data science, and also recognize that there's untapped potential for data science to benefit from greater diversity. And so we do that in a number of ways. We have a number of different programs directly through our idea state networks, directly through partnerships with HBCUs and other MSIs. I'll also highlight one of the programs that I'm heavily involved in, which is the AIM Ahead program, which is a flagship initiative for NIH in AI and machine learning and health equity. And we're directly trying to enhance the diversity of not just the data sets that are used for AI and machine learning, but also the diversity of leaders who are able to ask questions of those data. So we have a number of different programs in this space, but it is certainly a priority for us to make sure that this is an inclusive discipline as possible, and that we're doing our best to reach out.
Okay, thank you very much. I know those are really important and exciting opportunities there. I'm looking at the clock. I think we're gonna have to move on to the next speaker. Thank you. So Tanja Davidsen is up next. ODSS all hands meeting report out on data and compute infrastructure.
So thank you. Today, I'll be talking about a report out from the ODSS all hands meeting, which was held last December, specifically about data and compute infrastructure. So I'm going to give a little bit of information first about the meeting. It was December 13th and 14th of last year. The goal was to share the progress, findings, and recommendations from the current NIH strategic plan for data science, and to hear from the data science NIH colleagues on new opportunities and challenges in data science, also to network with colleagues across NIH, and to lay the foundation to update the NIH strategic plan. So the structure of the meeting, it was a 2-day meeting, and we essentially had 5 breakout groups, and everyone was assigned to a breakout group or chose a breakout group ahead of time, and you stayed in that breakout group for almost the entirety of both day 1 and day 2. So you were assigned either data, compute, and infrastructure. The co-chairs were myself and Valentina DeFrancesco from NHGRI. You could have also attended the FAIR data repositories and data sharing, clinical data science, software tools and methods, or intramural data science challenges. And there was active participation from about 124 NIH staff across all the NIH centers and institutes for this meeting. So day 1, again, and remember, again, you were in one breakout session and you stayed with that topic the whole 2 days. So day 1, each of the breakout groups from the topics I discussed in the last slide focused on the bold ideas to move NIH forward within that topic. So identify gaps and opportunities, bold ideas, cutting new edge technologies, ways to enhance interoperability, ways to engage the communities or develop new partnerships, to encourage diverse perspectives, and to identify gaps and opportunities in training and workforce development. And finally, how to foster data stewardship and sustainability. Day 2 focused on concrete steps to implement some key ideas from day 1. So again, the focus here was implementation. So we each picked 2 or 3 ideas from day 1. At the end of day 1, we voted on the ideas. So we probably had about a dozen ideas that came out of day 1, and we voted on them. And there were a couple, for our group anyway, about 3 ideas that really floated to the top. The goal for day 2 was to have concrete steps to implement at those ideas, new capabilities, or identifying, again, those training and workforce development ideas, and then to encourage partnerships and collaboration, both internal to NIH and outside of NIH. And then we were also to evaluate the impact and figure out measures of success for that implementation. So again, I'm just going to focus on the breakout group data and compute infrastructure that Valentina and I led, but then I will at the end talk about some common themes across all the breakout groups. So for our group, there were 4 key ideas. One focused on NIH-wide resources, which encompassed both all topics of data, computing, and modeling. The second was enhancing resources for artificial intelligence and machine learning. The third was enhancing the technical capabilities and assistance across NIH. And then finally, evaluation and impact. So our first key idea, NIH-wide resources. The impact here is to, of course, improve fairness of data, compute, and modeling resources across the NIH. And so here are the concrete steps that we came up with for infrastructure. We thought an initial step would be an assessment of our current NIH data repositories. Of course, as we all know, there's a variety of different repositories and computing platforms and modeling resources across NIH. There really needs to be a nice assessment of what currently exists so that we can find holes and overlap. A future step would be, as was mentioned earlier, an NIH data mesh, which is a decentralized and distributed system that harmonizes to services across the NIH. And this could include things like a searchable NIH-wide catalog of available resources, common APIs, metadata models, DOIs, and indexing approaches within our existing cloud ecosystems, of which there are many, some of which are listed here, CRDC, Anvil, Biodata Catalyst, et cetera, as well as new ones. User single sign-on system, which uses smart tokens to aid communication within the data mesh, offering data access controls, auditing, and accounting, which is building on the current RAS work, and enabling greater data availability for ICs utilizing strides. Some concrete steps within partnerships and collaborations still under the NIH-wide resources were to encourage a data science point of contact at each IC. We do have points of contacts already established for ICs kind of deep in data science, but we need to identify those at ICs where data science is not yet an established program. Build on and grow existing partnerships with other agencies and centers, including the DOE, the VA, the DoD, UK Biobank, and NSF Cloud Bank, to apply best practices, and ensure consistent support to awardees funded by both NSF and NIH. Finally, engaging third parties to conduct data analytic boot camps was another idea. The second key idea was enhancing resources for artificial intelligence and machine learning. The impact here would be to improve data, computation, and modeling infrastructure for AI ML analyses across NIH. And some concrete steps here could be increased efforts for data and metadata standardization and indexing, develop tools for ethical AI and reduce biases and training sets for the AI ML models, develop synthetic data sets used to train AI when real data is either too scarce or too sensitive to use. So these synthetic data sets could be shared publicly. Enable iterative model training as more data becomes available. Incorporate social determinants of health data in model training. Support IC and research communities to more effectively adopt AI with adequate infrastructure and tools. Again, and leveraging data collected from passive sensing devices to make localized AI models and collect de-identified EHR information. So all of those would be useful, I think, across NIH for AI and ML. Our third key idea was enhancing technical capabilities and assistance across NIH. The impact here is to improve the resources available to NIH staff who provide stewardship of the data and compute infrastructure at NIH. So some concrete steps here, first focused around sustainability. And we've really seen the need for these things to establish NIH-wide metrics and best practices for data, computational models, and software sustainability, to develop data retention metrics to help determine which data should be retained and what level of availability. We can't necessarily retain every piece of data forever, so having some metrics around that would be helpful. To socialize existing tools like DocStore and new computing advances that can be used again across NIH. Around guidance and best practices, guidance on interoperability so that all IC's data and models can be shared more easily. And to establish a data steward service to guide data from generation and curation to a long-term repository. Under funding to support ICs with limited data science expertise. Evaluation and impact. So what does impact or success look like here? We think that NIH data resources and data services, if we applied what I talked about in the last 4 slides, would be less siloed and appear more as a well-integrated and robust ecosystem across NIH. Data's models and computing infrastructure would be more widely and easily accessible. So a novice user without computational experience could easily find the data or models they need, export it to a workspace of their choice, and conduct analysis. So we really want to kind of lower the barrier to entry to these kind of computational experiences. And finally, the adoption of RAS would be more broad across NIH-supported infrastructure. So those are the things that we focused on in our working group or breakout group. But Susan noticed some cross-cutting themes across all 5 of the breakout groups. So she put together some slides that focused on those cross-cutting themes, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about those as well. So enhancing technical capabilities and assistance across NIH. I actually talked about that before, but specifically with regard to data and compute, and here it's more generalized. Integrating social determinants of health into the NIH ecosystem, and strengthening NIH engagements. So first, the enhancing technical capabilities and assistance. You can see the concrete steps here are to provide data training resources like MOOCs or curricula, videos, tutorials in a central location so that our staff can get hands-on practice, have a variety of technical trainings with domain-specific trainings as well, to provide support for individuals who want to take advantage of these resources across NIH. So this was kind of broadly seen as a goal across all of our breakout groups. Another concrete step would be to highlight successful NIH IC repositories or analysis platforms and interoperability use cases, and leverage those platforms as a training resource. Training in data management and fair data, including the ethical collection and use of data. Enhancing training in underrepresented and under-resourced communities, develop a community of practice to bridge investigators across disciplines, and to develop a mentorship program for NIH staff. The second key idea for the cross-cutting themes was integrating social determinants of health into our ecosystem. And just the impact here would be that social determinants of health data are the economic and social conditions that influence an individual and health outcomes. We want to increase the collection and use of these data with and enable a greater holistic understanding. So some concrete steps that came out here is to partner with HL7 and ONC communities to promote those standards with attention to harmonization across NIH. To enable linkages of social determinants of health data with other data types, including clinical, healthcare, and administrative, and to support activities with underrepresented groups to expand the use of these data models and data collection. And that came up, I think, also is in our AI/ML. Finally, strengthening NIH engagements. The impact here would be to increase the availability to share information on activities across NIH and reduce redundant efforts, and increase the effective outreach to researchers and scientific communities. So some concrete steps here include coordination of NIH-wide efforts with organizations like GA4GH, as well as agencies like the FDA and the DOE, to develop mechanisms for continuous input from within and outside of NIH on what has been working and what is not working, and to bring new expertise and communities, including those that have traditionally not been engaged by our data science community, kind of into the fold here. The final slide here is our next steps. So again, these are next steps at the kind of Susan Gregorick, Laura Biven level, updating the strategic plan for data science, including refining key ideas and the concrete steps that came out of this workshop, develop evaluation metrics to measure how things are going, to draft an updated strategic plan for data science, to get community engagement and feedback on that plan, and to present it to the SDC at the fall of 2020. And then finally, it's to have an updated strategic plan document by 2023. So that's it.
All right, thank you very much. I have about 1 million questions, but maybe I'll
my goodness.
I'll limit myself to just a couple here. So you brought up, as one of the key ideas, sort of cataloging the NIH-wide resources and sort of, developing this data mess. I guess sort of step one was this assessment. I'm wondering, what the status of that assessment is, what the plan is for that.
So I will say that these were all the ideas that came out of the sessions. I don't think the assessment has been planned or started yet. But that was what we thought would be the first step. But I don't know if Susan's office has started the anything in motion for that.
Okay. Well, if I can put in an endorsement for NCPI, right, through the data catalog, we have a catalog now of almost 1 million genomes and what cohorts they're associated with. And I was wondering too, if you could expand a bit about what your interpretation of the data mesh could look like. I know the next speaker is also going to speak to this point, but I'm interested to hear it from you.
So I think the term data mesh is kind of, encompassing a number of different strategies, right? So it could be, I think we all have data meshes. I think all of the ICs across NIH, right, that are involved in data science, which must be all of them, have something. They have catalogs, or they have websites. They have cloud computation opportunities, repositories where you can search and download data. The computation, of course, where you can go to the cloud, where the data is also stored, and compute on it right there without the need to download. So I feel like all of those kind of fit under the term mesh. So I use it as a very kind of general term to encompass a lot of what's going on with data science sharing of the data.
I see. But presumably you'd want kind of a unified search, right? So that, you could
Absolutely,
kind of find these
yes.
data.
So the goal would be to get all of these things that are already happening, right? And I think NCPI is a really great example of the beginning of that. Yeah. The goal is to get all these things that are happening to work together, right? So that you can search across all the data in the NIH. I mean, that's the ultimate goal, right? But we want to take it to the next level, so that you don't have to go to one place to find this data and then go to this place to find that data and then combine it on your own. We want all that data across NIH to be available easily for our researchers.
Excellent. Well, let's open up. Are there any other questions from the audience? Okay, well, I'm sure Tanja will be around, and you can find her on the chat if there's any sort of follow-ups. Okay, well, I think in the interest of time, we'll move on to the next speaker.
And so thank you for the invitation to speak today. This is going to be a little bit different than some of the technology discussions that we're going to have over the next couple of days. So my name is Carol Bult. I'm at the Jackson Laboratory, and I'm a principal investigator for the mouse genome database and also for the Alliance of Genome Resources. And the perspective that I bring to interoperability really comes from an evolutionary biology perspective and comparative genomics. And I think model organisms, of course, have a great deal to offer in terms of interpreting and understanding the human genome. So when we usually think about comparative genomics, we think about genomic entities and orthologies and analogous genomic elements between human and model organisms. But I think more important than that is the knowledge about what those genes and proteins do. And making these kinds of data, the knowledge about genetic entities, interoperable and shareable, has been a challenge that model organism databases and consortia like the Gene Ontology have undertaken for a number of years, decades. So if you look at each individual model organism database for fly, worm, yeast, etc., each of the mods actually represents very similar kinds of data entities and knowledge. Things like genomes, genome features, alleles, variants, models, reagents. And we annotate those for function, disease, relevance, phenotype, expression, etc. And we do also store some data that support these annotations as evidence. And another common activity of the mods is to increase the integration of data and the interoperability through the use of standard nomenclatures, bioontologies, and standardized data formats. And so this work over the years has been very successful, but one of the challenges that the community faces in using and integrating these data across model organisms is that each mod has unique user interfaces and things like APIs for data access. So in essence, although the data are very similar, they are effectively siloed because of the bespoke interfaces and access mechanisms to each of the model organisms. So this is one of the underlying and driving factors for why we formed the Alliance of Genome Resources. And the idea behind the Alliance is to build a knowledge commons to support comparative genomics. And we have two major goals. One is to develop common mechanisms for accessing the expertly curated annotations from the MODS and the Gene Ontology Consortium to really transform comparative genome biology and how model organisms can be used to understand the human genome. And then a second goal that I'm not going to talk about today is sustainable resource development and really doing more shared modular infrastructure development, build once, use by all kind of approach instead of the bespoke software development processes that have characterized our resources over the years. So this knowledge commons that the Alliance is building has really two components. And the first are the individual databases, the knowledge centers. And the responsibility of these knowledge centers, whether they're a model organism or data we obtain about humans from external resources, is acquisition and expert curation, sort of the standardization of nomenclature and knowledge representation, and connections with the organism-specific communities. The other component, which we call Alliance Central, is sort of the technology stack, the data management, programmatic, and web access. This is where the shared user interfaces and access mechanisms come into play. So the idea is to make common access to common data types across these model organism databases in a way that allows us to further investigate the human genome. So there's a lot of common data types and approaches in these model organisms databases, but just because we have the common data types does not mean we have common curation processes or biological concept representation. And the analogy that a colleague of mine described this as, what I thought was particularly apt, is that the octopus eye and the human eye have very similar structures and they do very similar things, but you can't swap an octopus eye and a human eye, right? The context, the biological context for those organs are very different. And we have very similar challenges as we've been trying to build the Alliance Knowledge Commons platform. So the real crux here to this whole project is this little arrow here, because this is where the magic happens that makes this whole initiative happen. And so I want to give you one specific example to illustrate why it's a challenge and why it's so important that we meet that challenge. And that's the case of disease annotations. So when you look at disease annotations across different model organisms, you're going to get very different concept representation. So in many cases, if you get a gene to disease association for a model organism, there really is nothing in that association that implies a common phenotype or underlying disease mechanism. It's often just a gene in a model organism that is an ortholog to a human gene, where that human gene has an association with a disease or is known to be causal. So the implication is via orthology alone. On the other hand, for other model organisms, when we have a disease annotation in our database, it represents a genotype-phenotype association. So there's a genotype on a specific genetic background or biological construct where the phenotype expressed for that genotype actually models the human disease phenotype. So this is really a disease model annotation versus an association purely by orthology. So this context is exquisitely important for groups that want to take these annotations and use them to better understand the human genome, or to use them in a computational predictive algorithm, maybe a machine learning algorithm, because the strength of evidence for the association in this case is much weaker than in this case. But if the context isn't understood, there's a great potential for misinterpretation and misunderstanding of the results. So one of the things that we've been focusing on, particularly in the Alliance, as we've been building this commons that allows unified access to the annotations for model organisms, is providing enough context so that someone coming in to get the data to use it in an algorithm, or just for comparison to their data that they're looking at for humans, is actually to represent the context in a very explicit way. So this is just a screenshot from the website for a particular disease, visceral heterotaxy. And in here, these are just a couple of genes that have associations with this disease. And in some cases, the association is implicated via orthology. So this gene in mouse is an ortholog of this gene in human, and this one in fruit fly. And so the association here is simply via orthology. On the other hand, for both zebrafish and mouse, there are actually models. So in this case, we say that the gene is implicated in this disease, meaning there is a genotype phenotype association in mouse that helps us to understand that this gene is likely causing the disease, this particular disease in mouse, and may therefore be an informative model for studying the disease in humans. And the way we represent that is through these details, where now you explicitly know which genotypes on which genetic backgrounds in mouse are true models of the human disease, along with the source of that information. And in the case of zebrafish, instead of genotype, they have a concept of fish, which is a strain plus, in this case, a morpholino. It's a construct reagent, kind of a different concept than what we have in mouse, but we represent the details so that that context can be explicitly understood, so that the information about the association, disease association of the gene, can also be explicitly understood. Not going to show you any screenshots, but one of the reasons that this is important is that there are actually many other alleles of ZIC3 in the mouse, many other genotypes recorded, but they do not model visceral heterotaxy. They might model a different disease, but you can't just assume that every genotype in the mouse or every fish or zebrafish models the disease. You have to have the context with the evidence in order to consume those data appropriately. So I think the real point of this is that without the context and without the harmonization of these annotations, we would not be able to effectively use the model organisms in any sort of computational context to better understand the human genome, or help inform disease or variant associations for human genes by comparing them to what's known about the phenotypes in the model organisms. The context is really very important, and the harmonization of that information in the Alliance, I think, is really one of the powers for comparative genomics that the resource has. So just a few closing slides. So we do have, going back to comparative genomics and the fundamentals of orthology, we do have a common orthology that we're using now. That's a new thing. Previously, every model organism database used their own orthology representation. We're now using a common orthology representation. And then because of the harmonization work that's been done, let's see, is it working? Yeah. Because of the harmonization work that's been done, we can unify across the disease ontologies that we all use and make these kind of visualizations that allow people to quickly see which genes and which species share different types of phenotypes and disease associations, which I think is really quite very powerful. And if we zip into the detail of one of those representations, again, this goes back to very similar to the previous slide, where we have the gene, we have its association type, the disease, the evidence, and the source. All of this very important for the integration of the data. So I think that the goals of the Alliance and the work that we're doing are really in alignment with what we heard about earlier for related to the modernization of the data ecosystem for NIH resources. This is really a knowledge-centric activity, developing the shared modular infrastructure, which I didn't have time to elaborate on, but really the kind of the key things for FAIR principles of harmonizing the annotation context makes for high quality computation ready data for comparative genomics purposes. So in terms of what's next, for the Alliance, we are still building the platform, but we're testing it now. We're extending it. The idea is to be extensible. So we're currently extending this to bring in other model organisms into this framework. And Xenopus is one of the first new model systems that we're going to bring in to the resource. And there are others in the planning stage. But I think we're at a point now with what we've developed and the data that we have accessible through a unified mechanism that positions us well to start working with the more human-centric data commons that all of you are working on, and trying to figure out how to bring this comparative data and annotations perspective into the other human data sets to inform interpretation of the human genome. And we have a few small grants now that we're doing that with the Kids First data for zebrafish and mouse, but I think we're getting to a point where I think we can expand that and really make significant contributions in this space, in this cloud interoperability space, because of all this work we've done on the concept harmonization. So with that, just wanted to thank, it's a very large consortium, very exciting project, and I just want to thank the executive steering committee meetings and then everybody from the Alliance as well as our advisory board, and be happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you so much, Carol. I see we're running a little bit short on time, but I did want to ask a follow-up about the extensibility. You know, thanks to Vertebrate Genomes Project, Earth Biogenome Project, and other large consortium, there's potentially, you know, many more high-quality genomes that'll be developed and other sort of resources available. I'm wondering, you know, sort of operationally and sort of maybe procedure and policy-wise, you know, how are we going to pick, you know, what can be folded into this context? You know, is it possible just to stand up a resource for any species? So the idea is that the standards, the platform that we're developing should be readily extensible, and there's like tiers of involvement, right? We could put in a species here
we only had orthology and gene ontology annotations, and that would be it. And gene pages would automatically be stood up from that, but you wouldn't get the disease and expression. You wouldn't get the depth of knowledge and biology about gene function and phenotype and disease association, but you get some superficial ability to compare that organism to the other organisms in the alliance. I think what this is going to allow is organisms that don't have a lot of resources to plug into the platform and leverage the shared modular infrastructure that we're developing. And so they would still have to have funding to do that, but it's a lot cheaper to integrate into a platform than it is to build a model organism database from scratch.
Absolutely.
So I think that's part of the modernization of the ecosystem that we're trying to usher in, is there are model organisms out there that could be really informative to the human genome that don't have a space yet and can't be integrated with the more standard model organisms. I think we're well positioned to have a place for those genomes to live. So and the level of detail about the annotations, that's going to depend on stewardship and funding, but we'd have at least some skeleton of representation. And I think that's better than nothing.
Yeah, that's very important and exciting. Well, thank you very much, Carol. In the interest of time, I think we're going to have to move on to the next speaker. And Samia, I see you're here with us now. Are you ready to go ahead?
Yeah, let me share my screen.
Great.
Hopefully this will be a quick one. Please keep me honest, even on the time. So I'm here to speak to you guys about interoperability and data mesh. Just a quick background, I'm Samia Rahman. I work at CGen right now as the director for data and AI, really looking at our holistic strategy architecture, as well as enterprise data management in the lens of mastering data. My prior context, Data Mesh was founded by Zhamak Degani. She's a close mentor, and I worked with her when it emerged back in 2019. Her first article was published back then, and I was partnering with her to execute it at healthcare. And then the next place that I applied Data Mesh was also in the life sciences space in big pharma. So diving into how do you achieve interoperability in data mesh, I'll quickly start with just a quick landscape of how data architectures have evolved, and then what truly is data mesh and where is it applicable, and how do we achieve interoperability within it. So this should be no big remarkable news for most folks here. Hopefully, we had the evolution of data warehouses, then data lakes and on-prem, and then came the same kind of patterns, but everything shifted into the cloud. What Zhamak talks about in her book, as well in the articles, is they all shared prior to 2019, they all shared these general characteristics of being monolithic, and there was the sense of centralized data ownership, and everything was organized, which is the people and the expertise around the technology. And this is this has been evident a lot in the healthcare space, as well as the pharma space, and very complex domain spaces. So you had the centralized IT teams. People would throw tickets over the line and say, hey, make this data set available. But the people who are working on it, your data engineers and others, they don't understand the domain. And healthcare and life sciences domain, I'm not an expert. It's hard for me. I don't have a degree in bioinformatics, or the word biomarkers is something I just learned over the last couple of years. So there was this huge gap that these architectures had imposed between the domain experts and the technology experts to get to that value we were seeking. And that's where data mesh emerged with the definition. It's a socio-technical approach. So if we kind of look at the history of books and approaches that were available, the DM Bach, I believe, that's the Dhamma principles or guidelines that were out there, they very superficially glossed over use iterative patterns or federated approaches, but it didn't really describe the how. And that's where I think data mesh has really brought together the social aspects along with the technical aspects coming together in alignment to build out those shareable, accessible, and manageable data that gives us value in those complex environments. And it not only applies within an organization, it can also allow for interoperability and exchanges of information and value across organizations. The 4 principles that data mesh kind of looked to introduce was to compensate for those failure symptoms we noticed in the prior data architectures where everything was very centralized. Data mesh poses that, hey, take the approach of being domain oriented and decentralize the ownership and make it available or do the work closest to the domain expert. So orient your teams around that. But when you start doing decentralization, the common thing to counteract is data silos. So that's where data as a product came through as the principle to compensate for the data silos. And that's where your FAIR principles from the data life sciences community that emerged in 2016 were incorporated into that principle, which I'll touch upon in the next section. And to make everything economical and sustainable in these large spaces, the call is to invest in a self-service data platform that reduces that cost of ownership and allows those teams to quickly deliver data products and get the value that they're seeking from it. I have a typo on the last one. It should be federated computational governance. That's where your policies that you would want in the global sense, policies can be from the schema policies, your critical attribute policies, to your security policies that you would want to bake into your platform so that you are encouraging good behavior in an automated manner. You're providing feedback to the teams that actually deal with the data. So just double clicking on that data as a product, this is where it's called out explicitly on data must be findable so that as a consumer of the data, I know where to find it, I know how to access it, the address, the connector, all of the service level agreements, all those things are available to me so that I can start using it. The interoperability is, in my opinion, it's conditional. Not all data might need to be interoperable, but for the situations where data should be interoperable, it should call out what those attributes are and what additional products.
Hey, Alfredo, Manuel, I'm sorry. ¿Necesitas entrar ahorita?
Sorry.
Please go ahead.
Oh, and then the 4th principle is around reusability or usability before you can even be reusable in those data sets you deliver. Usability is the first thing. So Jean-Marc calls out making the product valuable on its own. If you can't achieve that first foundational capability, then you can't jump ahead to reusability. And then trustworthiness is where, depending on the context, for FDA, we need to be compliant in our reportings, et cetera. So showing the data lineage is essential. To be SOC compliant in the financial reporting, it's important to show all the evidence, right? So you would want each unit of those data sets or data that you're making available for your customers to use to have all the trustworthy factors. It could also be your reliability. How accurate is your data? How fresh is your data? All those things matter as a customer of that data so that I can reliably use it for the value I'm trying to achieve. And then there's explicit call out. I know it's obvious for a lot of folks, but there is a tendency in some organizations and teams to not think about security as a first-class concern. So that is also called out. And then finally, natively accessible. This is, to me, a higher dimension of value that you can introduce so that your data is usable not only by, let's say, your data scientists or researchers, it should also be usable for analytics or your descriptive analytics by your Power BI engineers or your analysts, the report developers who are going to deliver any of the descriptive reports. So as you can see, data mesh calls for interoperability to be as a core principle that should be achieved for each data product. And it should be done in the context of the problem statement you're doing it. So in order to ensure that interoperability is achieved, double clicking into how do we actually achieve it. So here's a quick scenario, and there's a great article that I've referenced here. It's from Saxo Bank, who have done a computational governance aspect, and they try to achieve interoperability via the self-service data platform and those governance policies. So if we had a consumer system that would interoperate with, let's say, 2 upstream data sets, how do we actually go about engineering that good behavior? That's something I think can be incorporated into anyone attempting to incrementally and quickly get value to achieve that interoperability. So looking at that, the gray boxes that I looked at earlier, if we double click, what are some of those capabilities you might want to introduce? You can introduce a schema pipeline that can automatically offer anyone who registers in this data platform, shares their data or uses data to have compatibility checking. You can introduce an interoperability score. So not all data needs to be interoperable, but if you give the data product team the ability to have a score or feedback that, hey, your schema or your ontology could potentially match with these other data sets with these specific attributes. So an example could be in study trials, you have the investigator details, and an investigator in the pharma space can be a future customer. So there's interoperability there. And when those 2 data sets are detected, the schema pipeline can inform those teams that, hey, there's an opportunity for interoperability here. Another score, which I had thought was interesting from a webinar attended in Pistoia Alliance, is an ontology coverage score. So this could be your basic business glossary or the glossary for your ecosystem of data sets that are out there, and you can do matching of the ontology for each of those data sets to give it a score on, hey, this is most compatible or similar to another data product. So there's opportunity for interoperability. And then the other aspect, apart from at modeling and monitoring time of getting that feedback of opportunities of where you can interoperate, things to enable achieving interoperability would be to have your schema management system in which you can have contract testing. It's a very simple notion where your customer systems or consumer systems can have tests in their end, and these products should also have their schemas available so that the schema management ensures that there's no contracts being broken. So you want to make things backwards compatible, perhaps. If there are breaking changes, you might want to provide feedback before you go to production, and then do an incremental rollout. You can also bake in at runtime or deploy time the data quality rules so that your customer systems, you can monitor the health of these interoperability aspects to ensure that nothing is being broken. If for some reason the threshold of freshness or the quality threshold that you might have placed has dropped, you might want the corrective activities to kick off or not go to production until that's resolved. And then you might also want to introduce your connector management. So in this case, let's assume the data platform is simple flat files, and your connector is simply a parser and it's working over an API. You would want to make sure that those APIs are correctly versioned, etc., to ensure that these systems continue to fetch the data with the right your developer kits or connector kits. So I just wanted to share a glimpse of how you can achieve interoperability. I've seen this being achieved in different spaces in different ways. To me, the biggest throughout my career, the biggest impactful thing is achieving that contract test. If you establish the contract test as your first thing to achieve, then it becomes easy to have that feedback loop to even incrementally evolve your data products. So you can establish your first customer and then develop your data model, release that, and then incrementally find additional adopters to harden your schemas and the capabilities you offer. So to me, that is like the first investment to kind of prioritize. And then you can incrementally get to the North Star data models instead of trying to achieve everything from the get-go. I will pause there. I don't know if I just hit time. Stephen, you call me out, but I'll open it up to questions.
I think that's a perfect timing for questions. And I see Vivian has a question in the chat for you, Samia. Can you provide your thoughts on data mesh versus data fabric approaches? They are similar, but also different.
Yes. So I've dealt with this at a particular client. To me, data fabric is the tangible platform in which all your data is made available. Data mesh is complementary to it. Data mesh is not only that fabric, but it also provides the operational and team structures by which you can achieve that scalable data fabric. So what was happening in my experience, what I've observed is people who embarked on achieving data fabrics in the last couple of years, lots has changed, but I would say prior to like 2020, Agile, data ops, these were still emerging topics and they were not being applied consistently. So you had very delayed ways of getting to the value of the data fabric. So the promise of data fabric and the value realization was not happening in that incremental manner, which caused a lot of friction and frustrations. So to me, the two are complementary. I think data fabric is more focused on the technical aspects and the formats by which you might make the data available. It misses on the social aspects by which you manage data at scale within complex organizations. I hope that answers the question.
That helped me. I guess one question is if you could share your slides, that'd be really helpful. I would like to go back and review some of these links. I'm looking at the clock and unfortunately, I think we should move on to the next speaker. So that will be Titus Brown. So Samia, if you could stop sharing your screen.
Yes.
And then, I don't know, Titus, do you want to share or should Stephen? Oh, perfect. All right, Titus, thank you. Please take it away.
Yeah, so I think my sound's going out. Are my slides going out? How about if I do this? Even better. Look at that. All right. So hello, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak here. I think my talk is very much in line with the other speakers, so I'm feeling right at home. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about playing telephone with data and some of our early success stories with the GA4GH DERS, or I like to call it DRS, but I've been told the cool kids call it DERS. So apologies, depending on which side of the GIF gap you're on. So I'm here representing the Common Fund data ecosystem. This is a effort to develop, among other things, well, it's an effort to develop a socio-technical system across the Common Fund. And the ecosystem itself, we've been developing a federation system that's been centered on, but not limited to, a catalog that ingests metadata from about 10 different Common Fund data coordinating centers, data resources, that kind of thing. The metadata model here is indexed and then searchable from a centralized portal, and we support a really wide variety of data types, and we in particular have support for a really easy expansion to accommodate new data types as new Common Fund programs join, or as data types are needed to, as we need to elaborate data types. So I think the first thing I want to say, and what we sort of have working already, is this thing that we call the cross-cut metadata model. And here the idea is, as a federated system, what we're doing is we're pulling in structured and detailed metadata from many different Common Fund programs and integrating them into a single location, a single catalog. We're not storing the primary data. That's the responsibility of the data coordinating centers that we're working with. There's no data replication. There's no data warehousing. We're literally just storing relatively lightweight and currently still not restricted access metadata about the data sets that are available elsewhere from programs such as the 40 Nucleome, Kids First, Data Resource Center, and the NIH Human Microbiome Project, among others. So because we're producing this catalog, the next thing that people often want to do is get access to the underlying data. So you can find where the data, you can find which program has the data through our metadata portal. But what you cannot easily do currently is download that data and work with it yourself. So what we've been working on is a use case. And this is one example of a fairly general use case in which you want to collect different RNA-seq data sets, for example, from many different programs. Here, GTEx, IHMP, and Kids First. Then you want to subject them to expression analysis. And importantly, you need to analyze them, in this case, using, let's say that you need to analyze the data starting from the raw data. That is, you can't take pre-analyzed data because maybe different pipelines have been used to, in this case, actually different pipelines have been used to generate the data, the sort of, there's a word I'm looking for, the spreadsheet data that's hosted at GTEx or IHMP and Kids First. And here you want to actually do a compatible analysis of all those data sets. You want to do it, let's say you want to do it on a workbench like Kavatica or Terra, and then explore the results. So that's our use case. And then the philosophy that comes with it is that given that we have 10 different and soon more Common Fund programs that we work with, we really want to invest in standards compliance. And the idea here is that when a new CF program joins, when a new data coordinating center starts serving data, when new workflows emerge, when new workbenches emerge or evolve or are brought into the ecosystem or into NCPI more generally, or new analysis techniques are provided, we don't want to have to renegotiate how you get access to the raw data, what the metadata formats look like, and so on and so forth. So that's one part of our, this is what I call the N+1 problem. When you expand your ecosystem from N partners to N+1, you should not have to renegotiate really anything at all. The other thing, and this is a little bit harder to explain, is that, and it's based on sort of 12 years of teaching and training, is that the necessary place that we want to start here is that is with the biomedical data scientists. If someone who has some reasonable familiarity with the Unix shell or with R and Python can't do this workflow on the left, then effectively our experience is nobody can, except for maybe the engineers that built the systems. So the philosophy point here is, if you're trying to build something that biologists, biology researchers, and clinicians want to use, where you need to start, a necessary step along the way in our engineering and training and teaching experience is that you really want to start with the biomedical data scientists. Once they can use it, then you can build infrastructure on top of that to support all the other use cases. So the workflow from the user perspective here coming back to practical things, the workflow from the user perspective should be as simple as you go to the CFDE portal, you select the data, you find and select the data sets that you're interested in, you build this sort of manifest or shopping cart, you take that manifest or shopping cart, you bring it to you bring it over to a workbench. The workbench then goes and retrieves the raw data from wherever the workbench, from wherever the raw data is stored. That step is sort of invisible to user once they've entered their credentials for data access. And then you run the workflow and the results are available for interactive exploration, right? So this is nice and linear compared to the previous slide. And compared to the next slide, it is also much simpler and much more linear than what is on this slide, where what's going on behind the scenes is something much more complicated. These data coordinating centers are providing inventories to the CFDE portal, which is integrating them into a single place where they can be searched and added to shopping carts and so on. Then from the CFDE portal, a user can select the data sets they're interested in after finding ones that are at least in principle harmonizable, export them into a manifest format. Here we're using something called the NCPI manifest format, which is an early stage, just CSV style format for listing out data sets and their locations. And then the workbench here, Kavatica, has to then go back to the data coordinating centers that are hosting the raw data and pull in the data. And here's where DERS, which you'll notice so far I haven't really mentioned, is this underlying protocol that lets Kavatica negotiate with the DCCs around an identifier that's stored in the manifest format, but refers to a data set that may be hosted in multiple different locations via multiple different storage techniques and retrievable via multiple different protocols. And Kavatica can then negotiate with those DCCs, potentially offer authentication information via RAS, and then bring those data sets to the workbench in a cloud, hopefully in a cloud local way where they can be computed upon. And I think the important thing is that if you're talking about working with 3 data sets, this kind of workflow involves coordination across at least 5 different entities. If the data coordinating centers are the same as are hosting the data, there may be 3 different data coordinating centers here, one for Kids First, one for HMP, and one for GTEx. They each separately need to provide their identifiers for where the data is via this inventory to the CFD portal, which is party number 4. Party number 4 then needs to export this manifest format in a way such that Kavatica can read that manifest format. And then Kavatica needs to go back and talk to the data coordinating centers to get a hold of the raw data. And I don't know about you, but coordinating across more than 2 entities is already hard enough. 5 starts to become very, very hard. So here's the cool thing. This works. We've been able to, we've demonstrated this across HMP and soon Kids First, and GTEx will come soon, where we go to the CFD portal, we find the data sets we're interested in, we build that shopping cart, export it in NCPI manifest format, and then the missing step currently is importing that into the Kavatica workbench. Natively, we can import using the DERS IDs, but not using the full manifest. That will be working within a couple weeks. And again, for 3 data sets, this involves coordination across at least 5 entities. So it's taken us quite a bit of time to get to the point where this can work seamlessly and flawlessly. So I know I tend to have a sort of deadpan delivery of things. And I just want to say, like, I'm actually really excited about this. As a long-term, R, Python, shell person, like getting my hands on the raw data has always been a sticking point for many data analyses. And here, DERS provides a truly universal vision for dealing with many of the sort of annoying technical details of data access. And this includes access to restricted data, multi-cloud hosting, where you might have it in Google and Amazon and elsewhere, and you want to find the one that's closest to you, to the workbench or the place you're working, multiple different access methods for the data, changing hosting locations over time as the data migrates from one hosting platform to another, and then also support for long-term access to sunsetted data sets. So for example, GTEx and IHMP are both sunsetted. So we would like to be able to flip the storage buckets to request or pays so that people that want to use the data can pay for downloading the data and not the hosting center, which is sort of an important aspect of sustainability. So if there's a message that I want you all to get, and I'll say this again in a slightly different way in a few slides, is that DERS and the associated GA4GH protocols are really important for federating data sets. This is because they support many different aspects, including storage, hosting, access, and ownership issues that we found just within the last couple of years even to be very important in a very practical and crunchy way. There are some challenges with DERS. I think this is a supportive and friendly way to say it. DERS is not really in wide practical use yet. So there are many points of practical friction. It's a rapidly evolving standard. Different platforms support different versions of specific corners of the standard are unsupported on various platforms. Figuring all of that out has occupied a lot of our time. It's very hard to test. There's no simple interoperability test. There seems to be no compliant command line APIs that are available. Challenges remain with requester pays, which isn't currently implementable on some of the platforms. And this is really important for a number of our programs in the Common Fund, which have already sunsetted their funding. And then there's some interesting challenges around like who mints and maintains the DERS ID, and then who provides and maintains access to the data. They can be different groups, but generally speaking, you kind of want only one identifier for a data set, and then you have to figure out who's going to manage and maintain that access. And that, I think, is a sort of policy level issue that needs to be worked out as a variety of different long-term sustainability models evolve. And I think the other thing that I would convey, and this is after I think 5 years of interacting with the NIH on this kind of stuff, and many years before that, is it's really important to have user proxies that test all of this out. I've noticed over 12 years now that I'm going to be slightly sarcastic here because I think it's a good reminder to the engineers. Somehow the people that are close to the engineers always manage to get things to work. And it's the people that aren't really directly part of any of these programs that have challenges doing the things that everybody else seems to be able to get to work. So what we have been doing in the Common Fund data ecosystem is we actually have a fairly firewalled user engagement and training team that goes and just plays with the documentation from the engineers and the systems, and then tries to get everything to work, and then provides feedback from sort of a expert biomedical data scientist, but non-expert engineering perspective on whether things work. And we think that this is, in our experience, this has really helped move the dial or move the needle on DERS by communicating some of these blockages very quickly. I think I've already put this up. I just want to reemphasize, I think having user proxies, product owners that are testing all of this integration stuff out is critically important. And it's been a real challenge in a number of different fair data interoperability efforts that I've seen. Okay, I haven't looked at the chat. I see some questions queuing up. Hopefully they're not telling me I'm over time. I'll just finish and say, DERS is really, in my view, a fundamental building block for connecting biomedical data repositories to analysis workbenches. There's some wrinkles that remain to be ironed out, but we're getting pretty close. And you can feel free to contact me if you're interested in some of the details. I just want to thank Amanda, Bob, Victor Felix, Owen White, and others at the CFDECC who've really been instrumental in making all of this work. Like I sit back and take credit for it, but I'm just the salesman. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Titus. I see a nice question in the chat here. While DERS using signed URLs is workable for using a small number of large controlled access files like BAMs, it appears to be challenged by a huge number of small files like DICOM. All of the per URL signing appears to involve a large amount of overhead. Do you have any thoughts about how to mitigate them?
So actually on our end, on the Broad side, like we've done a bunch of testing with respect to signed URLs versus native access and stuff like that. And there really isn't anything that's inherently different scale wise with signed URLs and what we've found, at least.
I think that's a great response. So I'll just leave it there. Hi, Bill.
Hi. So I guess I'd argue, I mean, like for example, with Gen 3, at least it's shown to be problematic. Is there a particular aspect where it's done there versus what the Broad's been doing for it?
Yeah, I mean, we've been trying to do some, scale testing and trying to adjust things. And I know that Gen 3 has also been doing a bunch of testing around there, but there were some things that had been done with like not necessarily caching some credentials and having to, mint new tokens each time and stuff like that. And some of those things can significantly improve the performance. So I think a lot of this can be resolved. Okay. Signed URLs is the more cloud agnostic approach. It just has limitations.
Okay, thanks for the input. Maybe
I think I want to take my podium ability here and just say, this is sort of exactly what I'm talking about when I say that the user proxies are really important. There are going to be a lot of, and Bill, this is not intended as a negative. There are going to be a lot of different edge cases that we run into as this expands. But right now, and this is again just from my internal perspective and the documentation I see, there's not a lot of people actually using DERS in production. There's a lot of people minting URLs. There's a lot of people theoretically providing data, but there's not a lot of data use. And I kind of want to see more of that before we decide where to focus our efforts in sort of deep dives, if that makes sense. Because it might be that Bill is talking about something that's 80% of the problem, or maybe Bill's talking about something that's 5% of the problem. And I really don't know if that makes sense. I think we're really, this landscape still is pretty protean. So I would really like to see more people running into these problems and reporting back and figuring out how to resolve them. Adam?
Actually, I'm gonna let Allison chime in first. She may be saying the same thing I am.
I was just going to say, giving some perspective, one, like Titus, this is actually so exciting to see. Maybe from a perspective of, I remember being at the GA4GH, I think 2015 Leiden meeting in the cloud work stream, talking about putting together these standards. So maybe just some perspective on how long this really takes to go from a concept to actually a minimal spec. I remember walking out of, I think, the 2019 one and telling Brian O'Connor, good luck. So a lot of credit to Brian, I think, of taking this over the line. And I think, to your point, I think a lot of the problems back then was talking about it in the abstract of what would we want if we had this, et cetera. And I think my daughter Stella is excited about DERS also. But I think to that point of now's the time, it's in there. Some of our teams are starting to use it across platforms and pushing on the implementation piece to really move it forward.
Yeah, let me just chime in briefly on Allison's point and maybe comment to just some of the questions. So, Titus, I just wanted to again give kudos to your team for working with us and others to implement this use case, and maybe just highlight something you sort of glossed over, which is especially unique and differentiates what you're doing from some of the previous interop work we've done on NCPI, which is the CFDE coordinating center and portal are not the data owners. They are not hosting the data. You are essentially acting as a cataloging framework that still empowers users to bring the data sets together. And that's a key milestone moving forward. Then the respective DCCs who have both governance, ownership of the data and their distribution. And so I think that's something to highlight. And in respect to the DICOM, I just wanted to highlight, maybe this relates to sort of the data mesh discussion, the implementation of DERS and what is the data object is actually an important question to ask. And if you ask imaging people, what is a data object, they will have a very different answer than like genomicists, because they consider objects, the relationships between them in a different way when you think about imaging theories and the actual imaging files and their connectedness. So there's actually some modeling as it relates to what you assign a DERS ID to in the context of making it searchable and findable from an imaging user's perspective. And that potentially relates to this notion of the need to make sure like the domain owners and stakeholders are actually involved in the design process in ways that they may not typically be if you're simply assigning DERS IDs to DICOMs, as a DCC. So I just wanted to highlight that it's going to be an unsolved problem and a requirement, for the users to successfully leverage DERS.
So I really like this discussion, but I'm also looking at the time. What I propose is let's put a bookmark in here. There's going to be a 2-hour breakout later this afternoon where we can have kind of in more depth discussions. Also, I'm really sorry we cut into the lunch break. So what I propose is let's save a full half hour for lunch. We'll restart again at 1:15. A few of us will stay on the call so that if people come back early, we can let them know. But let's plan to restart at 1:15. Thanks so much to all the speakers this morning. It's really been a great kickoff to this meeting. And I look forward to the rest of the session this afternoon. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you soon.